We have to report to you, though, I'm afraid our Prime Minister still does not appear to have any common sense. He appeared on our show yesterday with his press conference at Downing Street, 8:30, where he attempted to basically point out that the reason that he withheld information, and he admitted doing it quite deliberately, the reason he withheld information on the Southport killer was that he did not want to prejudice a trial. He was immediately taken to task by a whole series of journalistic questions from Beth Rigby at Sky to Harry Cole from The Sun, all of whom said, listen, Prime Minister, we all know what the rules are when it comes to contempt of court. We've all been through journalist school. We all know what the law is. The bottom line about the law is that you don't have to completely clam up and give no information out whatsoever just because somebody has been arrested. And of course, we all know that the judge and jury and executioner in all of these cases, when it comes to terrorism, is completely and utterly inconsistent. We know, for example, that they called the Manchester Arena bomber a terrorist pretty early on in the investigation. He was not going to have a trial, of course, but they decided he was a terrorist without having to worry about what the legal definition was. The same goes for Joe Cox's killer. He was a far-right terrorist. The same goes for the man who drove into a crowd of people in London, in North London, at a mosque. He was branded a terrorist straight away. You know, so they've been completely inconsistent, and Keir Starmer is hiding behind something for which I think is going to get him into an awful lot of trouble. This morning, he's written for The Sun, and he talks about the Amazon killer, a man who went and did that terrible rampage in Southport, was able to buy a knife on Amazon. It doesn't matter where he bought the knife, does it? He wants to clamp down on the internet. If that's where he wants to go, that's another story altogether. We'll bring you all of that, plus loads more. This is Morning Glory. Theo Usherwood is here. Very good morning to you, Theo.
Very good morning to you.
There's a whole series of different types of headlines, but much of them are focusing on the fact that both Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer yesterday wanted to kind of give the impression that the reason that this horrible, horrible episode happened in Southport, where 3 little girls were murdered in cold blood, loads of other people were stabbed, is because of the internet. And let's face it, it's not because of the internet. Yes, he was able to buy a horrible knife on Amazon. Yes, he was able to order it. And yes, he was able to get it delivered to his house. But by far and away, the biggest number of stabbings that happen in this country happen with a kitchen knife.
Yes, and he could have bought it. He could have bought it anywhere. The rules aren't tight enough. Harry Cole's got the exclusive story in The Sun that they're looking basically at expanding technology. From my understanding, it's already in use, where you have to use a live selfie and then upload a scan of your passport or digital ID, and then you can go, and then you can, and people can use that at the moment if you want to join like a hire car club or something like that. And they want to do that for knives on Amazon to stop people buying it. But it's worth mentioning, of course, this would only kick in when this would be necessary to prove you're 18. Yeah. But Rudakubana was only a couple of weeks off his 18th birthday when he went and committed this horrific, murderous attack.
And if he hadn't been able to get a knife on Amazon, he would have just taken one out of his mother's drawer, wouldn't he?
Yeah, he could have got a knife. He could have got a knife anyway. But you could
go steal one from a supermarket. I mean, what's the big deal?
Yes, and you mentioned, of course, the government has yesterday, when we had the early press statement from Keir Starmer at 8:30, and then the follow-up House of Commons statement from Yvette Cooper, is trying to get ahead of the story because there are some difficult questions. Difficult questions which came up in the House of Commons from the likes of Nick Timothy, former advisor to Theresa May, now an MP, saying, hang on a moment, why didn't you tell, why weren't the British public told about the background Rudakubana much earlier on? And interestingly, there's a story on the front page of the Telegraph. Police claim they were gagged over Southport terrorists, revealing details, background details, that Merseyside detectives had wanted to provide details about the killer's background, including his religion and crimes, but were warned not to do so by the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. Interestingly, yesterday, Yvette Cooper, when she responded to Nick Timothy, was like, no, this was a decision for the CPS, nothing to do with us. They didn't want to prejudice the trial. But before somebody is charged with a crime, you can release details.
This is the thing. Before there's a charge, there are plenty of things that you can say about somebody who has been arrested. And I've always had arguments with lawyers over time in newspaper offices and now in broadcasting offices, because, there is a fair amount of wiggle room. And one of the things that's very clear about the law, and Keir Starmer should know this better than anybody, having been supposedly the chief public prosecutor, as he keeps reminding us, is that the law is a movable feast. It is not static. It is never written in stone, in a way, because the reason why people go to court is because they challenge the law. And the fact remains that if you are the defendant and you have a lawyer, your lawyer will be making all sorts of arguments in court on your behalf, which will change whatever you're being charged with. You know, so the idea that there are it's very Starmer-like, isn't it? The idea that there's a very sort of strict set of rules.
He's a lawyer.
By which, but he's not a very good lawyer, because all lawyers that I know are people who understand that everything is an argument and you can argue about anything. This guy, Starmer, seems to think that there's a framework which is like a straitjacket outside of which you cannot go. And that's simply not true.
If you have lawyers here, I'm sure they come up and they go, well, Mike, you could do this or you could do that.
Exactly.
And this is the implications of doing one or the other.
And here's what you can't do, because that would prejudice the trial. But there's plenty that you can do that won't.
But from my experience of court reporting and from crime reporting, and I did quite a number of years at it early on in my career, everything kicks in, everything gets serious at the point of charge.
Yes.
And there was a window before charge.
That's when sub judice begins.
Yeah, when a criminal is charged, that's when everybody has to be on their best behaviour and ensure that they don't prejudice criminal proceedings.
I mean, there has been, I would say, of late, a kind of a creeping caution, if you like, from some lawyers when it comes to media reporting, because they'd rather be safe than sorry. So some of them will say, well, there is an arrest, so the case is active. Well, yes, but there isn't a charge. So you can't be accused of being sub judice, because until there's a charge, there's no court case.
That was always, and I remember reporting on cases, and you could go to the scene of a crime. You could get some quite a lot of detail about what had happened and what is the background to either the alleged perpetrator or the actual details of what happened at that crime. At that scene, which may have just happened a few hours previously, and you can report on that. But when the police announce the charge, put out a press release saying an individual has been charged, then you have to be much more cautious, and that remains right through until the very end of the court case, when of course all of the details can be released when you have a guilty verdict at the end of a court case.
Exactly right. And it seems to me that Keir Starmer, and many people have made this point, Nick Timothy among them, and also Nigel Farage and Richard Tice, who's on the show later on, they're making the case that he has used this to hide behind, and the fact that he withheld information is definitely true. He's admitted it, but the reason why he withheld it, he's pretending, is because of a sub judice situation, when it's not. Let's have a look at what Harry Cole from The Sun actually said and asked him about yesterday.
Terrorism, or what constitutes terrorism. And my concern in this case is that we have clearly got an example of extreme violence, individualised violence, that we have to protect our children from and our citizens from. And it is a new threat. It's not what we would have usually thought of as terrorism when definitions were drawn up, when guidelines were put in place, when the framework was put in place. And we have to recognise that here today, because I think most people would say, looking at the facts of this case, it's clearly extreme violence, it's clearly intended to terrorise. And I completely accept and understand that, and that is my view. Therefore, we have to make sure that the law and the framework for responding is appropriate to the new threat that we face. And there we will make whatever changes are necessary in the law to deal with it.
You see, there he's hiding behind it again, because he's saying that's my view, right? So first of all, he's not saying that's the law, saying that's my view. He talks about this new threat of a lone wolf type attacker. Well, it's not a new threat. You know, we've had that since London Bridge. We've had it since the Manchester Arena. We've had it in many ways throughout the course of the last, I would say, probably dozen years. But there's nothing new about lone wolf threats.
What's also interesting, and they're making it, they were trying to make, Keir Starmer was trying to make this distinction, Yvette Cooper was trying to make this distinction, is that this case wasn't picked up because there was a lack of ideology that was driving Rudakubana. So whilst there was clearly evidence that he was extremely violent, and he had a propensity to watch extremely violent material online, because there was there was this manual, but there was nothing that actually purported or supported the argument that he was driven by a particular ideology.
But everybody knows terrorism.
But that's rubbish, by the way.
Yeah, of course it is.
That's rubbish. And I'll tell you why that's rubbish, because they've already changed the way they're treating terrorism cases, because 162 cases were referred to prevent last year just because the person had looked up school shootings. Not all of those will have an ideology behind them. They'll be just lone teenagers sitting in their bedrooms, Googling away or YouTubing away, watching really violent material. They've already caught up. They're already moving in that direction. And that's why I just don't understand this argument that when you have an extreme act of violence, like what we saw in Southport last July, horrific, the police could have come in and said, actually, this is terrorism.
Yeah, and again, because the people of this country are not stupid, the people who watch this show are not stupid. They are perfectly capable of working these things out. They're perfectly capable of understanding what's going on. They know absolutely that if this had been a far-right act of terrorism, they would have been describing it as a far-right act of terrorism from the beginning. But they also would know that this is people looking for an excuse not to call it terrorism, because the question that nobody asked yesterday, and which I would like to ask Keir Starmer, if he ever had the cojones to come on this show, is basically, why are you so scared of calling it terrorism? What's the problem? Why can you not call it terrorism when it clearly is? And the answer to that question, of course, is because we don't want to inflame community tensions. That's what they mean. Well, right? They're worried that somebody will run down to the local mosque and set it on fire.
Yes.
Even if it's got nothing to do with Islam.
But clearly,
right?
when you looked at this, when we got the details of this case, it had. There was a shred of evidence. There was this manual, this Al Qaeda manual, but actually this was not driven from everything that was come out of the case. This particular case was not driven by Islamist extremism. That was not the driving purpose.
Right.
What was the driving purpose in this case, and it should be classed as terrorism, was just this obsession with violent material online.
But was there not a line, though, yesterday as well, in the knowledge of what happened when he was arrested, that he was shouting Allahu Akbar as he was stabbing the children?
I may be unsighted on. I'm unsighted on that. But there was when he was looking up material that led to him being referred to Prevent. There was a whole host of things, like obviously there was MI5, there was the IRA, there were school shootings, as well as the Middle East, for example, and so forth, and therefore. The argument that was put forward by the prosecutors and was made by Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer yesterday, Mike, was actually there was no underpinning ideology that meant that this could be classed as terrorism in this particular case.
But if you're reading an Al Qaeda manual, right, which is telling you how to attack people as a terrorist, you're a terrorist, right? You may well be an Islamic terrorist. If you're shouting Allahu Akbar as you're murdering young children, you're an Islamic terrorist. I don't care what your religion is. I don't care whether you were raised as a Catholic, you know, or as a Church of England scholar, or you know, as a Buddhist. You know, you are an Islamic terrorist. As simple as that. But they're frightened of saying it. They won't say it.
Yeah, and Keir Starmer, you know, he didn't say it yesterday. They won't say it. Yvette Cooper didn't say it yesterday, because I think you're right to say that they're
terrified of it. They're terrified of it. And why are they terrified of it is my question, and that's the question I'm going to be asking throughout the show today. Also, we're going to be talking to a series of legal experts to find out precisely what it is that you can say and that you can disclose, and why Keir Starmer didn't disclose what he didn't disclose is nothing to do with the law and everything to do with his cultural sensitivity, which he said yesterday he didn't want to be a factor. So, you know, he's kind of talking in doublespeak, isn't he? Because on the one hand, he's saying we need to be more transparent. He wasn't. We need to have no fear about upsetting cultural niceties. You know, that's exactly what he's afraid, what he's been afraid of in the past. So, you know, he's calling for things to be changed, which are already within his gift to change.
I think what they were trying to do yesterday was they were trying to just pin it. And there is an argument to say, you know, the only person responsible for what happened is Rudakubana, right? He did what he did, and it was a horrific terrorist attack in Southport. And what they were trying to do, and you talked about the internet and so forth, is to frame it in that particular way.
Yes.
So that it didn't become, you know, to your point, you know, he you know, this is where Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper are now launching these multiple local inquiries when it comes to the rape grooming gangs. That actually they're not, you know, they're saying they want, as you say, unburdened by cultural sensitivities and institutional.
But they're the ones that have invented that particular framework. They're the ones who have wrapped themselves up in this blanket of cultural sensitivities, and that's why they don't say things. So it's their own fault. I mean, he's written in The Sun today, Sir Keir Starmer, on page 12, terrorism has changed, he says. We must guard against loners and misfits who threaten us, and I will root them out. But according to Alan in Merseyside, he said, does Starmer know what he's talking about? Terrorism hasn't changed. This monster isn't the first lone terrorist. Remember Joe Cox and David Amos. Starmer makes a fool of himself every time he goes on TV. And that's true. You know, everything he said yesterday was knocked down, basically, by a series of very good questions from very well-respected and long-time journalists who know exactly what the laws are, and MPs who know exactly what the laws are around contempt of court. And how can he get that wrong? That's the thing that surprises me. He's meant to have been an expert in the law, and particularly criminal law, and he appears not to be.
What he's done, Mike, is he's taken the hardest line that a lawyer could take. Right? He's taken it as the sort of, as you pointed out, you said there's wriggle room.
Yeah.
There is wriggle room.
He's
taken the hardest line and he's applied it to this case, and then said anything outside of that, of that purview, anything outside of the parameters that have been set in this case will end up with Rudakubana walking free from court and justice not being served. And that is not the case.
No,
patently is not the case.
Definitely not.
Previous cases demonstrate that is not the case.
Right.
Before charge, you can release details about, and indeed, when you have charges, the pertinence of the charges, as we saw in October when the Ricin charges were released, come to light. So there is always going to be an element of factual reporting that journalists can do before a case reaches trial that does not prejudice the case, but is put out to reassure people as well.
That's the other aspect.
There's an element of public reassurance.
That's the other aspect, because if he wasn't working alone, for example, and there was maybe more than one of him, or people were concerned that there might be more than one of him, because often in these cases there are other actors who have either helped them or who are planning to do something else. Surely the public in Southport deserve to be told whether this is a lone wolf, whether this is a lone terrorist, whether this is somebody who they believe is working with other people, just for their own safety.
Yes,
apart from anything else.
Yes, and people up and down the country will want to know, won't they? Are we going to see a copycat, or are we going to see other?
Was he working with
part of
anybody
a
else?
cell?
Yeah,
exactly. All of those
questions.